Welcome to the Sky News Courier-Mail People's Forum. Thanks for being with us. Please put your hands together for Premier Palaszczuk and LNP leader Ms Frecklington. We've got about 50 undecided voters in the room chosen by YouGov, a bit smaller than we'd expected. A big Brisbane storm this afternoon has prevented a few people arriving, COVID as well, but about 50 undecided voters in the room. We'll get to their questions in a moment. We're going to start with some opening statements. We had a toss of the coin beforehand, before broadcast. The opposition leader won. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kieran, and thank you to the audience members. It is great to be here and I can't wait to be able to address some of your questions. The LNP has a big, bold, visionary plan for Queensland. It's all about growing the economy and creating jobs. Now, I've got a vision for Queensland, and that is to make Queensland an economic powerhouse once again. It's all about making Queensland the best place to live, the best place to get a job and the best place to raise your family. So we'll start by injecting $1.1 billion of stimulus back into our local economies with our $300 rego rebate. We want to get that money back into community before Christmas because we know you've done it tough. We'll also provide more and cheaper before and after school care so our mums and dads of Queensland can get back into work. And of course, the LNP's bold, visionary new Bradfield scheme to create jobs, to secure our children's future and to make sure that we drought-proof regional Queensland. This is on top of building the second M1 and four-laning the Bruce Highway. We want our roads to be safer. And we also know that when Queensland is building, Queensland is working. Thank you, Kieran.
Premier.
Thank you, and good evening, Queensland, and good evening, everyone here in the audience. It's wonderful to be with you. Of course, we know that this year has been like no other. This time last year, no one expected that we would be facing a COVID pandemic. But my number one priority has been to keep Queenslanders safe. And because we have kept Queenslanders safe, because of our strong measure on the borders, we've been able to open up our economy. And just look tonight, we're here because our economy is open and Queenslanders are safe. There is nothing more important to me than Queensland families. But if we're going to continue to grow our economy, we've got to focus on getting people back into work and back into jobs. And that's what drives me every single day. There is dignity in work. There's dignity in having a job, people being able to put food on the table. And that's why we want to continue our infrastructure plan. We want to continue making more things in Queensland. We want to continue to make sure we have a robust health system by putting on more doctors and more nurses and a really strong education system and giving our young people the opportunity to get a job. This is the vision I see for Queensland. I'm asking Queenslanders to stay the course. Now is not the time for change. Now is the time for stability and not chaos. Now is the time to work together. With me, you have a Premier for all of Queensland. I take into account all of our state's interests. I travel the length and breadth of Queensland. And there's one thing that drives me the most, and that is the people of this great state. And what you see is what you get. People know me. They know me for who I am. They know my values. And what you see is what you'll get through this tough time.
Premier, thank you. Now to the first of our questions from our undecided voters. Please introduce yourself. Fire away.
Hello, thank you for having me. Lisa from Newmarket. My question goes to both of you, but you're talking about reopening the state, etc. Which is great. I'd like to know why you closed it down for only 6 deaths over the COVID. The majority of those people were 4 people, 1 male over 70 and 3 women over 80s, with no disrespect to them, because I missed out on going to 2 funerals myself for people who were over 90, okay? Yeah. And I was stopped doing that. You closed down the churches, you closed down lots of things, you closed down small businesses. I personally know people that have suffered from being closed down. Now, you close down the churches, which is pretty much what you need in this kind of atmosphere, and you need your faith and you need something that you believe in and you should be able to go to. People ridiculed that, you know, but you allowed protests and you allowed the protest a few weeks. BLM protest, not really anything to do with Australia, by the way, and you allowed Rebellion Extinction or Extinction Rebellion to protest and disrupt the normal taxpayers of Queensland, and you don't come down hard on those. And I personally know the guy that superglued himself to the bench, only for him to go out and disrupt further, because you're just slapping them on the wrist.
OK, Lisa, thanks. We'll get to the question now.
The last one, yeah, well, the question is, what are you going to do in the future? And hopefully, Deb, you'll remain committed to small business, because in 2019 there was 264 influenza deaths, and in 2017 1,100 people died, and there were no closed downs or lockdowns.
OK, we'll hear from the Premier first, and then the LNP leader. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa, and that's a really important question. Let me tell you that when we first heard about the COVID pandemic and what was happening in China, the information that I got from the Chief Health Officer was that we were looking at potentially tens of thousands of Queenslanders losing their lives. Now, you lose sleep on that. I absolutely had sleepless nights worrying about what was going to happen to Queenslanders. The Chief Health Officer told me we needed to immediately call a state of health emergency, and that's what I did at the end of January. We were the first state to do that. I spoke to other premiers, I called for a National Cabinet meeting, and my calls went unanswered. But you only have to look at what's happened in Victoria with the second wave. And Lisa, to your point, thankfully we've only had 6 deaths here. But there's 6 people who've lost their lives. In Victoria, more than 700 people have lost their lives. And I can say that overseas, you only have to look at the second and third waves. They're saying that Europe is about to have its bleakest winter. Be under no illusion, COVID can happen at any time if we don't keep our robust quarantine system, which we do have in Queensland, and we've seen 18,000 international arrivals that have come back through hotel quarantine. And my job is to keep that safe. And we had to act quickly, and we acted as a nation. Everything was shut down for that 4 to 6 week period. But we see what happens when COVID gets out of control, and thankfully it appears that Victoria is now getting under control. But the Leader of the Opposition called for the border to be open 64 times. Gladys Berejiklian wanted the border open, the New South Wales Premier, and she's even said this morning that Ms Frecklington would have opened the borders. We would have had a second wave here like Victoria, and the consequences for small business and industry would have been absolutely diabolical. Now, every single day I work with the Chief Health Officer and the Health Minister, Dr Stephen Miles, to keep Queenslanders safe and to ensure that we have a robust health response. And as I said, in the midst of this pandemic, now is not the time for change.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's Lee. Thank you for your question. Very importantly, when it comes to this year, Queenslanders have done it really, really tough. And I just want to thank each and every Queenslander for what you have done to keep Queensland safe. We really thank you. Everyone has done what has been asked of them. But what I would say through this COVID pandemic for Queensland, what we have seen has been a distinct lack of consistency, compassion and common sense when it comes to some of the decision-making. And in relation to funerals, many of your listeners and many people here in the audience will remember Sarah Cassop and remember the fact that she was unable to go to her father's funeral. And that was a tragedy. And that's why at the time I said if I was Premier, I would have asked the Health Minister, the Chief Health Officer, to develop a COVID-safe plan to allow people to attend events such as funerals so they could say goodbye to their loved ones, so they could actually recuperate at home if they're recovering from brain surgery. These are the decisions that we must show compassion, we must show consistency, and we must show some common sense, because I'm with the other Queenslanders who don't understand why AFL footy stars, celebrities, they get a free ride in, but someone recovering from brain surgery doesn't get to recuperate at home.
Let's hear our next question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Barry from the Mansfield Electorate. I manage the operations of 2 international language schools that are privately owned and family operated. Since the international borders have closed, new business has been almost non-existent, and I'm unsure as to what the future holds. South Australia and Northern Territory, I understand, have recently been working on a pilot program at federal level to bring international university students to Adelaide and Darwin. and more recently New South Wales and Northern Territory have been included as part of a travel bubble for New Zealand travellers, which may extend to some parts of Asia. My question's in two parts to both leaders. First question is, what level of importance do you attach to international students returning to Queensland, given this industry represented the third biggest export industry to Australia pre-COVID? And the second part is, what plans or discussions have taken place to involve Queensland in the creation of a safe pipeline to allow non-university international students, and more specifically English language students, to enter Queensland in 2021 to maintain the share of this economically valuable sector?
Thank you. We'll start with the LNP leader. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barry. And you've hit on such an important topic because you've already quoted it. But the international education space provides around, it's our third largest export. It's a massive boom to the Queensland economy. And not only for the education space, but for the jobs that a lot of those educational students do and have here in this great state of ours. What I have done, Barry, is I've actually met with all the Vice-Chancellors of the universities about this exact point. Now, they called a meeting with me because they were very disappointed that the Queensland government hadn't engaged with them in relation to making sure that Queensland was going to be a part of that conversation nationally. We know that that conversation has happened now with the other two states, and Queensland has missed out on that opportunity. The Queensland international education market provides so much back into our economy. It provides jobs. Our regional universities like Central Queensland University, which I just visited this week, are crying out in pain for the lack of students. They need to get them back into Queensland. We need to look at how that bubble is working for those other states, and let's hope that if Queenslanders decide to elect an LNP government, what I can give you this commitment is I will continue to work with the federal government, the federal Morrison government, to make sure industries such as yours, which is vitally important to the Queensland economy, gets to continue.
Premier.
Thank you. And I have concerns about opening up the international borders too quickly. And there's one single reason for this. We cannot afford COVID to come into Queensland. We can't afford a massive outbreak, what's happening in Europe and the US and Southeast Asia, to happen here in Queensland. It has to be sensible and it has to be measured. Our most robust system for dealing with COVID is our hotel quarantine. And as I said, we've dealt with like 18,000. But unfortunately, some of the ideas we're hearing federally is about allowing international students in but not hotel quarantining. That is a huge risk.
I've not heard that
huge problem. That is a huge problem for Queensland. Well, I have heard it, and I'm very worried by it. So what I've said is that I will see how the trial goes with international students coming back into, I think, a couple of other states are trialling it at the moment, and we'll see how that goes. But let me say this, we can't rush a whole lot of international people coming into Queensland and putting at risk our quarantine. At the moment, our hotels are keeping up with the demand. And as you know, we've increased our intake from 1,000 to 150, and we've said we're going to increase to that by another 150. We cannot extend our resources that would put the lives of Queenslanders at risk. So yes, I do acknowledge international education is really important. It's really important for our economy. But Queensland has been able to open up internally and do the things that we would do from our normal lifestyle because we took those tough measures with our borders. Now, I'm very concerned to hear the Leader of the Opposition talking about opening up our Queensland border too quickly and now talking about opening up our international border too quickly.
So I think you're verballing me there.
No, you have said to open up our state borders. You did it, your party did it 64 times. And today Gladys Berejiklian came out this morning and said you had a phone call with her, you get along very well, you're friends, and that you should have opened the border months ago. And we would have been exactly like Victoria. Now is not the time to risk. Now is the time for stability, and now is the time for leadership to be able to listen very carefully to the Chief Health Officer, which is what you get from me.
Do you believe, Deb Frecklington, that the Chief Health Officer has been too cautious? Is that the nub of this?
I have said that I will follow the Chief Health Officer's advice. The Premier is simply...
You called for the borders to be open 64 times.
And then miraculously the Premier opened the borders.
That is not true. We have not opened our borders to Western Australia. and we have a border bubble. So don't misquote me, please.
Well, Premier,
You called for all the borders to be open, with Scott Morrison, with Josh Frydenberg, with Peter Dutton, with Gladys Berejiklian, and I stood strong.
I think it's a sore point because the Premier opened the border.
On behalf of the people of this state.
Opposition Leader, please. Yep.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's mainly because the Premier then opened the border and then the Victorian second wave happened. I think we need to be really clear about this.
You are misleading about
Sorry, Premier, let's hear from you.
And when we're talking about getting international students back into the state, that is not talking about opening up the international borders.
So how are we going to cope? And which countries are you going to allow in?
Well,
Which countries are you going to allow in?
The Premier, what you have done has completely closed the door on one of the most important economic drivers in this great state, and other states are taking that opportunity.
Our hotel quarantine cannot cope at the moment. This is another risk. Now you are putting at risk Queensland lives by saying you're going to open up the international borders. What countries are you going to open up to?
But
tell
Premier,
the people.
other states are looking at this. The federal government's looking at this through facilities like Howard Springs. Why won't you?
And they're saying not hotel quarantine, Kieran. That's what I'm concerned about.
Let's go to our next question.
Good afternoon, Ms Palaszczuk and Ms Frecklington. My name is Jack and I'm from Red Hill, and my question is for both leaders. Given the immense impact of COVID-19 on the music and arts industry, being one of the last industries that will be able to operate at full capacity, I'm interested to know if either of the parties have a solid recovery plan for the arts, seeing that a lot of income has been impacted and so many jobs have been lost.
Okay, Premier, first to you.
Yeah, look, thank you. And of course, that's a really important question. And as a former Minister for the Arts as well, I'm very passionate about the arts industry and very severely hit. It's great to see now that some of our productions are starting back in COVID-safe plans. But life is not like it used to be. So we have to make sure we take the advice. So the health advice is that events outside are safe if we have COVID-safe plans. So I'd like to see more performances happening in this state, but we need to make sure that we follow our COVID-safe plans. As you see tonight, we have a COVID-safe plan. The reason we have to stay separated is because if someone had the virus and you were too close, you pose a risk of actually catching that virus. We are going to have to live like this for a long time until there is a vaccine developed, and that vaccine may be years away. So we have to continue to have our COVID-safe plans. But we will continue to back the arts industry. We're building a new performing arts complex at South Bank, which my government's investing in. We've contributed up in Cairns as well. And of course there's an art gallery also being built in Rockhampton. But I want to see young people and people in the performance industry get back, and it was just wonderful. One of the first performances back was done by the Queensland Ballet, which I had the chance to see. And the performers were so excited because they said to me, we haven't had the chance to perform, and that's our work. Our work is performing. So whatever we can do to continue to assist, we will.
Okay, Jack, you happy with that answer?
I think so, yeah.
All right, let's hear from the opposition leader.
Well, thank you very much, Jack. And what I'd say to you is please hang in there, because you guys are so important to Queensland as well. And it's not just because my daughter's boyfriend is part of a duo called Syrup. I'm going to give them a plug. But these poor young guys, what they're actually doing is having to do 2 shows a night in front of half the crowd that they normally would. And it's really hard work for them. So I really just plead with you, hang in there. Keep plying your trade, because it is really important to Queensland that this generation who are struggling at the moment to actually do the arts and what they do best. So what is most important is that we are, of course, follow all the COVID-safe plans, but we also remember that this is a generation of Queenslanders that we can't leave behind, and that is why we'll continue to support the arts.
Okay, our next question. Thank you.
My name's Marilyn. Good evening. My question is to both leaders. My question is, why do you think it is that we have the highest unemployment in the country, even before COVID, and presently even higher than Victoria? And also, what do you plan to do to ensure jobs and opportunity for young people and for those with families to support?
Opposition Leader, first to you.
Well, thank you very much, Marilyn, because it is a fantastic question. Because before COVID, for the last 4 years, Queensland has suffered under the highest unemployment rate in the nation. And even through COVID, Victoria has only just come out of lockdown. And Queensland has more people unemployed than Victoria per capita. 209,000 Queenslanders are out of work. And the reason why is because we've got a government that have got the wrong priorities. They're not focused on getting people into work. They're not focused on growing the economy and creating those jobs. They're focused on themselves. And in stark contrast, what you have with the LNP is a big, bold, visionary plan to grow this economy and create those jobs. And that is why it is so important that we have a plan. Now, this is a government in Queensland, the Palaszczuk government. They don't have a plan. They don't even have a budget this year.
That's not correct. That's not correct. We have said that if we are re-elected, we'll have a budget.
Premier, sorry, I'll come to you in a moment, but let's just hear Deb
Yeah.
Frecklington, please.
Well, they don't have a budget this year, Marilyn, and I'll say this. This was a government that said that they would bring their budget forward so Queenslanders would have confidence in what the government was taking to the election. Well, that has been a false promise, and only the LNP have that bold, visionary plan, a vision for Queensland, a vision to get our kids and the next generation into work, because Queensland deserves better than being at the bottom of the economic ladder. I want to see a Queensland that is right up here again. The Queensland that I grew up in was an economic powerhouse, and that's the Queensland I want to see for my children and for everyone else's children.
Okay, Premier.
Thank you. When Deb Frecklington was part of Campbell Newman's government, unemployment was 7.3% and there was no COVID pandemic. They cut 14,000 jobs. They decimated regions. And when you take jobs out of regions, you really hurt communities. Now, in the 5 years that we've been in government, we created 250,000 jobs. We delivered 5 budget surpluses. And we have said that we will hand down our budget before the end of this year. The LNP has said they will hand down their budget next year if they are elected.
Within 100 days. I just sort of plug that in.
Now let me say this very clearly. We are absolutely focused on getting people back into work. That is why we have a strong economic recovery plan that will support 55,000 jobs. Our election commitments have also been worked out. It would be an additional 50,000 jobs. And we will make sure that our young people get free TAFE, under 25s, in areas where we know there are going to be workforces needed for future. We know that our regions are strong. We need to make sure we have jobs across regional Queensland as well. And we will fight very hard for every single job. Now, you may talk about Victoria. Victorians are not working at the moment. They have been in lockdown. They've been in absolute lockdown at the moment. They are slowly coming out of that lockdown and they're on JobKeeper. So their figures are not being conveyed correctly because they're actually not working. What we saw last month is 1,000 jobs in Queensland were created each day. 1,000 jobs. That was the highest rate of any other state across the nation. And also too, we found that those states that had strong border measures, their economy was rebounding faster than others.
Let's ask Marilyn. Marilyn, you happy with those responses? You feeling more optimistic about the labour market?
Probably just also concerned about how long we're going to be shutting our borders and worried about COVID and when we're going to get past that, which I think will help employment.
Can I say about that too? Look, I think everyone is concerned about, and people say to me, when are we going to get past COVID? We're not until we get a vaccine. That is the reality. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that we are focused on looking after Queenslanders, supporting Queenslanders and growing jobs in Queensland. And we will listen to the Chief Health Officer's advice. What you see from me is a leader who will look after you and will take the advice. This is very complex. It's epidemiology, it's about what's happening in the other parts of the world, and we're learning more and more about this virus. What we're being told too is if you get the virus, afterwards there may be further health consequences to do with kidneys and heart, and when people do get COVID, it can actually have long-term impacts. We are learning more and more about this.
Okay, let's hear from the opposition leader just to respond to Marilyn's final issue there about
Well,
the
thank
balance.
you, Marilyn. And what I would also say is this. I mean, the reason why the Queensland economy is struggling so badly because of COVID is because before COVID, for the last 5 years under Labor, the Queensland economy was struggling. We had the highest unemployment rate in the nation for 4 years, lowest business confidence, highest number of bankruptcies. These are shocking statistics, all because we've had a government that has been more focused on themselves instead of you, the Queenslander.
That is so not true. You would have opened the borders and decimated this economy. We would have been like Victoria. There would have been no one working.
Okay, let's get our next question.
Question to the opposition leader, though I'm interested to hear what the Premier says as well. Thank you. I never thought I would see a hard border between New South Wales and Queensland. However, for 9 weeks, I could not visit family in northern New South Wales in a hospital. However, AFL footballers and celebrities could cross. I just heard the opposition leader say that you would follow the advice of the Chief Health Officer. But what if that advice is to close the border again? My question is, in the event of a COVID-19 resurgence, how would you mitigate the risk of COVID-19 spreading while still allowing people like me to visit family across the border?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I didn't get your name when
it's Adam from Cooper.
Adam, thank you. Because I answered this before when I talked about consistency, compassion and common sense, and making sure that as a government we have COVID-safe plans to attend things like a funeral, for example, or to be able to go see a loved one who is dying, or to be able to go and make sure that if you have to go from Brisbane or Queensland to Sydney to get life-saving operation, then it is taken into consideration. Of course, we must always follow the health advice and keep Queenslanders safe, but we always must show consistency in the decision-making. You've touched on it. Celebrities and sports stars got a free ride, but others didn't. And that is the lack of compassion that I believe that has been shown.
Adam, how many loved ones? Can you give us a sense of the situation?
I had a loved one in hospital. I wrote to my state MP and they gave me the standard answer, which is the Chief Health Officer says no, so you're not going. So I'd like to know what you would do different.
Well, in relation to the Chief Health Officers, I've actually said what I would do is this. I would direct the Chief Health Officer or ask the Chief Health Officer to create a COVID-safe plan for situations such as you've pointed out. Okay, Premier, do you have any regrets in terms of, situations like Adam's? I guess
these are very hard.
People not going to funerals?
These are very hard situations. I know how difficult this is for people, but I have to take the health advice. I have to take the advice of the medical experts, the medical practitioners. I'm not a medical expert. And what we have done is a couple of things. The first thing is that we created that border bubble between the communities, the border communities, which I think has helped a lot of people. And during that time, there have been over 300,000 exemptions for that border bubble. Secondly, Queensland has granted the largest number of compassionate exemptions, over 1,100. And when we started hearing these tragic stories, I asked if they could actually enhance that response unit in health. And we now have over 110 people there working. But why do we have exemptions? We have exemptions because we had a strong policy on the borders to keep Queenslanders safe. And the best news I hear every morning when I wake up is when we have 0 cases. And that is because of the tremendous effort that every Queenslander in this state has done.
But Premier, have you had any second thoughts at times when you've seen the sort of heartbreak that has been alluded to, Adam's difficulty? Would you see him through the same scenario again?
Of course it's heartbreaking. Like, I know how hard it is when we had to, when we had an outbreak here in Queensland and we had to do contact tracing and everything. Our hospitals had to be locked down and our aged care facilities. For a long period of time, people couldn't go and visit their loved ones in aged care facilities and in hospitals. I have an uncle who's going through treatment at the moment. No one in our family could go and visit him while he was in hospital as well. I understand how difficult these situations are. But I'm just saying we have to listen to the health advice, and we are trying to make it as easy as we possibly can for families, but it is very difficult.
Let's, well, we're about halfway through. I'm going to just pause with our voters' questions. I'm going to go to a couple of the reporters covering this election, one in the room. First of all, our political editor joins me, Andrew Clennell. Andrew.
Kieran, thanks. To Annastacia Palaszczuk, I cannot be there tonight because even though I'm in Canberra, I live in Sydney and I'm allowed into Canberra, and your border bans mean I cannot attend the People's Forum. You have the highest unemployment in the country, as one of those present pointed out, in the September labour force figures 7.7%. Isn't your tough on borders policy at odds with creating jobs? And if Queensland has to be COVID-free for 28 days before the borders are open to New South Wales, does that mean you have to reset every time there is a new case? And what will that do for the economy?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for joining us. And what I can say is a couple of things. Look, first of all, we have taken these strong measures on the health advice, and that is exactly what Queenslanders would expect me to do. And you say that you live in Sydney. Well, obviously the New South Wales Premier wants to tear down our borders, as does the Leader of the Opposition, putting everyone's health and livelihoods at risk. I reject your comments about Victoria and Queensland. As I said just previously, we've got the highest participation rate, and 1,000 jobs a day were created last month in this state. And we have a strong economic recovery plan which we have focused on the people of this state, involving manufacturing, looking to new industries such as defence, creating a new industry in green renewable hydrogen, which can be exported to other parts of the world.
But is that 28-day requirement too onerous? Is it?
Well, Karen, let me say this.
Because you'll never reopen that.
The Deputy National Chief Health Officer said our aim was no community transmission. That's from the National Health Officer. Now, my advice is, you know, we've got great results happening now in Victoria. As they come out of lockdown, we need to watch very closely what happens there. But in New South Wales, I watched the grand final the other night, and the comments made during that grand final were they are very concerned about seeing what happens as a result of those large gatherings. So we are watching that very closely, and when the health officer says it is safe to open up the borders, we will do so. But I'm not going to be pushed into it. I'm not going to be pushed into it by people who have other interests at heart, and that they do not have Queenslanders' interests at heart.
Andrew Clennell with a question to the LNP leader.
To Deb Frecklington, you've pretty much come on board with Annastacia Palaszczuk now on borders, and apart from being time, there does not appear to be that much difference between the two parties. Why should Queenslanders vote for Deb Frecklington, a less experienced leader in that circumstance? How would an LNP government actually change the state?
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for the question. And there is a distinct difference. And the difference is this, because the LNP have a positive plan to actually grow our economy and create jobs. I mean, we're looking at visionary nation-building projects. We're talking about getting Queenslanders back into work by four-laning the Bruce, the new Bradfield. I mean, these are big, bold, ambitious projects, but they have to be done. I mean, you cannot sit back in Queensland and accept being at the bottom of the economic ladder. I mean, no Queenslander that I ever meet wants to be below Tasmania and South Australia, even though we love those states, but still, you don't want to be below those people. Queensland should be right up here, and that is why we need to have a bit of vision. We need ambition. And we need a bit of hope back in this great state of ours. And that's why the LNP's plan is all about growing the economy. It's about creating those jobs. But it's also about making sure we're actually looking after Queenslanders. It's not about the politicians. It's actually about the Queenslanders. And that's exactly why I got into politics. I got into politics because Labor had been in power for too long. Our health system was on its knees. That's why I've announced we're going to partner with the private sector and clean up the long wait list that Labor have left us.
Do you agree with the Premier on that 28-day requirement? And basically, I assume if there's one case, there's a reset on that 28-day period. Is that the case?
The Chief Health Officer takes into account a number of issues. She said this quite publicly, and she says it quite often when she does press conferences. She also looks at the rate of sewage testing and the amount of testing that's happening in other states as well. So she'll provide her advice to us, and as I said, that we'll be making that decision before the end of the month,
Is that reasonable,
Friday.
do you think?
Well, I understand the Premier is making that decision on Friday in relation to the borders, and I was very interested to hear the Premier's outgoing Tourism Minister on radio this morning say that she really hoped that decision would be that the Premier would be making on Friday because on behalf of the tourism industry and the businesses, the people that are out of work, because I think there we have a minister who is actually leaving because she gets that Queenslanders deserve to get back into work.
Let's bring in Steve Wardell now, the State Affairs Editor at the Courier-Mail. Steve?
I'm going to ask a question that's not about COVID or the borders, just to mix things up a bit. To you first, Premier. Your former Deputy, Jackie Trad, has insisted in the past that coal miners would have to reskill. Your current Deputy has questioned whether Queensland should be opening new thermal coal mines a number of years back. Your government used the black-throated finch as a stalling tactic on the Carmichael mine, and you're currently using the courts as a stalling tactic on New Auckland mine. With a record like that, how can Queenslanders trust that you'll maintain and grow the thermal coal industry?
Okay, let me make a couple of comments, and thanks, Stephen, for that question. First of all, under my government over the last 5 years, we have helped secure $21 billion worth of investment into our resources sector across our state, supporting thousands of jobs. Let me make it very clear, my government supports the coal industry, we support the gas industry, and we support the renewable industry. And we're trying to grow the Northwest Province by helping to back Copperstream, which goes from Townsville all the way out to Mount Isa to help develop that new Northwest Minerals Province, which would actually mean...
Sorry, Premier, the question is about, the question about thermal coal.
Because we're also looking there at those minerals that are needed for batteries and the technologies that the world also wants. Now, just a few weeks ago, we also approved the Olive Downs mine. That is metallurgical coal, and most of that coal will be exported over to Korea and to some parts of China. Now, why is that important? Because no one else has told me an alternative for making steel. So we back all of the jobs that brings our state together. And I'll make this final point. New Auckland mine is currently has been heard in the courts, and the decision is pending. I'm not going to interfere in a High Court decision where the decision could be made any day. So we need to let that run its course.
Okay, Steve, to the LNP leader.
Deb Frecklington, I'm going to ask another question about energy. Your energy spokesman, Michael Hart, said in October 2017 Annastacia Palaszczuk should listen to the warnings and ditch her crazy 50% renewable energy policy. Your coward MP has taken out advertisements labelling renewable energy a fantasy. Is renewable energy crazy and a fantasy? And will you ditch the renewable energy target?
Well, not at all. It is certainly not crazy and a fantasy. What I have actually announced this election period, in actual fact, over 12 months ago, which is really exciting, and it's big and it's bold, and that is the new Bradfield scheme. This is going to be Australia's largest dam, but on top of that, the largest hydroelectricity, 2,000 megawatts. That is enough hydroelectricity to power 800,000 homes. Just imagine the industry and the jobs that can flow from that, Steve. That's really, really important. The other thing that I will say is this, and I have to pull the Premier up in relation to the High Court challenge, because I have said we will secure those jobs at New Hope Auckland. They are real people. There are 90 people that have actually...
So you won't wait for the court decision?
Well, because the Premier is misleading the truth. The court decision has nothing to do with the approvals process. In fact, Olive Downs mine is in the same place as New Hope. That is true, and that is the truth.
That's not true.
Because we must support those jobs. But, Steve, of course, the renewables industry is important to Queensland, as is the other resources. And I'll say this, another exciting announcement that we made is because the solar panels are now reaching almost the end of life, about 20 to 25 years for a solar panel. The LNP have announced that we're going to create a recycling industry for solar panels because, of course, we want to see more, but we also need to make sure they don't go into landfill. So we make sure that we are recycling it properly. And how exciting is it that we could have roads and other recyclable products made out of those solar panels.
Okay, let's go back to the voters now. Our next question.
Hi, my name is Jim. I'm in East Brisbane. I'm very pleased to hear that you are listening to scientific and health advice from your medical officer. I was just wondering, has he said anything about what happens if around 7,000 million tonnes of coal is burned from the current approved coal projects, and what health advice he might have for people after that's burned?
Jim, my health officer is a female, so it's Dr. Janet Young.
I'm terribly sorry. I did actually know that, and it absolutely evaporated from my brain.
No, that's
sorry.
okay. That's all right. Well, the Chief Health Officer is advising me on COVID, and in relation to mines, we have thousands of people that are employed in our coal industry. We've opened up our gas industry, and we have a really robust renewable energy industry. When I came to office, there was about 7% of renewables in this state. It's now over 20%, and all of that is at risk if Deb Frecklington gets elected. But let's also be very clear. In other parts of the world, and I was even speaking to a man recently from South America, and he said to me that in South America most of the mines are shut down. No one is working. No one is working because people are in lockdown. Their families can't even go and visit each other. There is no mining happening in other parts of the world. In Europe, the same thing is happening. Restaurants, bars closing, industry shutting down. I mean, in Queensland, we have a strong resources sector, we have a strong agricultural sector, we have a strong renewable energy sector. All this is happening in Queensland because of our strong health response. And that means our economy is happening and it's going ahead, and my plan for the future is to grow more jobs in more industries.
There are other jobs related to the tourism industry. The Great Barrier Reef, one of the great assets of this state. Warren Ench, an LNP member, is a special envoy to the reef. He's warning that, among many others, that climate change needs to be taken seriously. I guess it's a bit of a tangent to that question there, but it's still relevant to the impact of the industries that both of you are supporting very heavily tonight.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And of course, the Great Barrier Reef is just our most incredible natural asset, and we must and should do everything possible to secure it. And again, and I'm sorry to keep trumpeting back to the new Bradfield, but I'll give you a great example of the environmental benefits to that project. So during the monsoonal rains, those huge amount of rain that comes down almost every wet season in far north Queensland, what the new Bradfield will do is it'll capture that water, and instead of it flowing out and creating that silt plume on the Great Barrier Reef, it actually drives that water west of the Great Divide, and it captures the water so we can have the largest growing area of food and produce, almost larger than Tasmania. So that's some really exciting and great environmental benefits for the Great Barrier Reef.
Okay.
Just to be clear, there's no health advice on surviving 45, 50-degree temperatures on the regular? None at all?
In relation to burning coal?
Yeah.
Well, I will say this about the resources industry in Queensland. There are tens of thousands of mums and dads and people who work in that industry. Regional Queensland thrives on that industry. We must make sure that the next generation has an ability to get a job and get ahead in this great state of ours.
Let's have our next question. Thank you.
Cool. I'm Natalie, and I'm from the Green Slopes Electorate. Just a question for both of you. If you're elected, what will the fellow Queenslanders my age who are looking at getting their first homes and starting families? Most of my friends, we've been talking in the last few months. It's a huge decision if we get the house or start a family. A lot of them have said that they're just not going to bother with children because they can't afford them. So how are you going to convince us to bring the world into the world the next generation of Queenslanders post-COVID times?
Well, Natalie, thank you so much for your question. And let me say this. The Queensland that I want to govern, the Queensland that I want to be a Premier for, is all about you and your next generation. And that's why I have announced the big, bold, visionary projects to get Queensland working again, so you can have a bit of hope and ambition back. That's why I've announced things like, and I said it in my opening statement, before and after school care, because we need more places, not less, and we need to make it cheaper for you. So if you do go back into the workforce, if that's what you choose to do, that there are available places. Now, childcare is one of the most expensive prohibitors to going into the workforce, and that's why I'm so supportive of it. Mum of 3 kids, I've been working my whole life. I know how tough it is. But you need an economy that is firing on all cylinders. You need a government that understands that it's your future, that it's not okay to have the highest unemployment rate in the nation. No matter how you want to fudge the figures, Queensland is behind the 8 ball compared to the other states. I want Queensland to be a place where you want to have heaps of kids and that you bring them up and that they've got the best education. But you know the other thing that's really important, Natalie? For all those country mums, all those bush mums out there, under an LNP government, we'll restore the maternity services back to regional Queensland, because I want to be a premier for all of Queensland. And I've often said it's not just about the southeast or regional Queensland. If you choose, Natalie, if you choose, and I hope you do one day, to go and live in regional Queensland and raise your family, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could have the services where you want to live?
Okay.
And that's the sort of government that I want to lead.
Premier.
Well, thanks, Natalie. And Deb Frecklington was Campbell Newman's Assistant Minister, and she presided over 4,500 cuts to our health service right across our state, including nurses and midwives. What sort of government cuts nurses and midwives? What I've said very clearly is I want to grow our frontline health staff. We will employ an extra 9,000 health professionals, including nurses and midwives and doctors across our state.
Just make them work a bit harder.
Now, let me say this. It's great to hear the Leader of the Opposition talking about all of these plans, but let me make it very clear to every single one of you in this room. Deb Frecklington has announced $26 billion of unfunded promises. She is refusing to say to anyone here tonight how she is going to fund her election commitments. The only way she can fund them, she said she's not going to borrow. We've been very upfront with the people of Queensland. We said we're going to borrow $4 billion to keep people employed and to get people back into work. Every single person in this room has a right to know tonight, before they leave, how is Deb Frecklington going to pay for all of these promises? She talks about the Bradfield scheme. Well, how is she going to pay for it? The only way, if you are not going to borrow money, the only way is to cut, and the cuts will be savage. Around 30,000 people will lose their jobs in this state, including nurses, including doctors, including teachers and teacher aides. Well, I say to you, Deb Frecklington, you are part of the Newman government. You are Campbell Newman's Assistant Minister, and this is exactly what you said before, exactly what Campbell Newman said before the last election, and then went ahead and did those savage cuts.
Well, isn't it interesting, ladies and gentlemen, that the Premier, who has no record to run on, is only focused about a government where Queenslanders spoke about that government. The Queenslanders have had their say on that government.
Tell people how you're going to fund your election commitments.
New team. I've already announced more doctors, more nurses, more teachers.
And how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it?
More police officers, because our community deserves to have the services no matter where you live.
How are you going to pay for it?
I have already announced that we will improve the frontline services. Let me tell you what happened yesterday with the Palaszczuk government. The Treasurer of Queensland came out and said doctors and nurses just have to work a bit harder. Well, my goodness me, how much harder do these poor people have to work? They already are working every hour that God gives them to actually fix up Queensland health services, and they are under so much pressure because there are 56,000 Queenslanders on the long-term wait list under the Palaszczuk government.
And with the costings, to answer that question?
Yeah, and
this is the single most important question for the Leader of the Opposition tonight.
Well, let's hear it. Let's hear the answer.
Well, thank you, Premier, and thank you, Kieran. And in relation to that, one of the first things we'll do is we will stop Labor's waste. Let's look at the priorities of the Health Minister.
How are you going to pay for the $26
Premier,
billion?
please, let's hear the answer. Let's hear the answer first, please.
The Health Minister's priorities was to spend almost $500,000 of yours, of taxpayers' money, not on looking after the kids that are getting chemo in a kitchen in the Lady Salento Hospital, but actually spent it on ripping down the name. What sort of priority is that? That's a government that is out of touch.
With all
now,
due
when
respect,
the Premier,
how are you going to pay for your $26 billion of election commitments?
When
we have said where our money is coming from.
Okay,
Well,
Premier,
we
let's just, LNP leader, if you can wrap up on that.
Yeah, well, and I'll
then
say
we'll
this,
move
our
on.
debt will always be lower than Labor's.
No, how are you going to pay for it? How?
Let me explain exactly to the ladies and gentlemen that are here tonight.
Everyone's voting at the moment. People have voted.
And Premier,
time is running out.
I remind you of the last election when 2 days before the election day, which is when the costings come out.
We put ours out on Monday.
Which is when the costings come out. The Premier last election
ours
announced
went out on Monday.
4 new taxes and then got into government and actually announced 9 new or increased taxes, $3.5 billion
That is not true.
out of your pocket.
And your costings will be tomorrow?
The question is,
that's right.
Okay.
But every
Our
single
costings
person
will be
here,
tomorrow.
Karen, needs to know tonight, how is Deb Frecklington going to pay for all of these commitments she's been talking about during the election campaign?
And Premier, if you're waiting to see whether you want to vote for us or not, just wait until after tomorrow
That's
afternoon.
a definite no.
And
the borders would be open. We'd be like Victoria or the rest of the world. That is not
Premier,
the type of
if you wait
Queensland I
until
want.
tomorrow afternoon, you'll be
Why
able to
can't you
vote.
tell people tonight?
You'll be
You have
able to vote,
100
and won't
people
that be
here.
exciting
You
to
have
vote
100 people
for
here.
a visionary?
No, you have 100 people here tonight.
Well, she said tomorrow. The
I
LNP
said
leader said tomorrow the costings
so how
will be
about
out.
you vote after tomorrow,
let's
Premier?
move to the. We have a lot
I think
of
that's
viewers.
very unfair to the people who are here tonight.
But that's what you did last
they'll know as of tomorrow afternoon.
we put
and
ours
now
out on
let's
Monday.
move
Thanks,
on to
Kieran.
North Queensland
It's a very
because
important question,
we're in the
most
southeast.
important question of this campaign.
We're in the southeast. I want to ask a question for North Queensland, and first to you. This relates to the issue of crime. The curfew you announced, a very blunt instrument. How does that work, say, 2 16-year-old kids after the movies going home at 10:15 p.m? Should the police intervene?
No, not in relation to that. It is a blunt instrument, and I'll tell you why. So I've been to Townsville 30-odd times since I became the opposition leader 3 years ago. Crime is out of control in North Queensland. Labor's soft on crime is not working. Their soft on crime approach just isn't working. They rolled back the breach of bail as an offence. They've got slap on the wrist if you end up in court. It's a rotating door. And what we must do is if there are children out on the street late at night, well, then there must be something wrong at home. And that is why we must make sure the community and the children who are on the streets are kept safe.
So the police will use their discretion?
Absolutely, and we will make sure it is a 6-month trial. I'll be very clear about that. This is an immediate solution to an immediate problem that is facing those people up in Townsville and in Cairns. And I was up there when Sammy's shop was broken into at night with a knife put to her husband that big by an 11-year-old. Now that kid should not be on the streets. We must put them in somewhere safe. We must clean up the crime problem that has gone from bad to worse under the Palaszczuk
Premier,
government.
why should the people of Townsville believe you that you can manage this problem? They've been saying it's a problem for a long time now.
Kieran, I think that people have a right to feel safe in their homes. They have a right to feel safe in their communities. And that is exactly why I announced that we will be investing in more police, more frontline police, an extra 2,025 over the next 4 years. That's around an extra 150 for each region. Now, the last time they were in office, they sacked 150 senior commission officers and they wanted to sell off the Townsville Police Academy. That's the track record. Now, in relation to this curfew policy, the Leader of the Opposition has not been able to explain that policy to anyone at any time during this campaign.
Happy to.
And Karen, you're exactly right. The problem is a mum and dad whose son is, or a daughter who's working at McDonald's or working at KFC late at night could get picked up, and that is not the right message we want to be sending to people who are going about doing the right thing.
Okay, just quickly your response. I want to move to some voters' questions and whip through a few before we wrap up. Just quickly,
yeah,
if you
look,
can.
there's a reason why there are 6 police officers already on my team. There's a reason why a senior police officer is running for the seat up in Townsville. It's because crime is an issue. We cannot close our eyes and our ears to this. this problem. It is hurting our children.
But you cut
it's
police
hurting
when you were in
our-
office last
and it's
time.
hurting
You
our
cut
communities.
police.
And that's exactly
Okay.
why we are putting more police officers, toughening up the laws, because it is not okay that these little kids are on the street.
Okay, I
it's
want
not
to
okay.
get to another voter question. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name's Aidan. I reside in the seat of Maywa. I was just wondering if there's any scope in the state government legislative framework to restrict overly prescriptive local planning policy. I believe that a one-size-fits-all approach to our built environment is extremely unhealthy, and I was just wondering whether there's anything going around at state government level that might help solve that problem.
Aidan, do you have an example that you were thinking of at all? Is there something happening in your local community?
Not in my local community at the moment, except some of the stuff I'm working on and have been working on. It seems as though the policies that exist have outcomes that are more favourable to larger corporate developers rather than smaller outfits. And in the building industry, it seems as though the smaller outfits are finding it a little bit difficult to participate and be creative at a smaller scale, because the planning policy in Brisbane points to larger developments rather than
If
smaller.
you could just give me a quick response, if you don't mind, a minute each. We've got to get to closing statements.
Most of this, thank you very much. Most of this is in the jurisdiction of the local councils. I'm sorry, Aidan's just in the local councils. But in relation to the way in which planning works, we have priority development areas where we are looking at having more social housing and affordable housing, because we think that's really important, especially in this time where people are finding it very difficult to make ends meet and may not be able to afford their first home at this stage.
Yeah, look, exactly. It is in the local government authority area as well, but I will say this. I do know that in the suburbs of Brisbane, overdevelopment and those planning issues is one of the biggest issues. And I certainly heard that in Toowong when I was just there the other day.
And before we get to your closing statements, last question on a minority government. Surely if you get to 46 seats, you'll negotiate with the crossbench of the minor parties?
I've said no.
And I've said no.
OK, so 46 will have to go to the ballot again, another election. All right.
I'm asking for a majority.
Closing statements now, if we start with the opposition leader. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you so much for your interest in being here tonight, interest in Queensland's future. Now, the choice in this election is abundantly clear. You can have more of the same, of economic incompetence, 209,000 Queenslanders without a job, 56,000 Queenslanders waiting on the health list, crime out of control in North Queensland and on the Gold Coast. Or you have the LNP with a bold, ambitious vision for your future, for the future of Queensland, for the next generation, for our children, which involves making sure that we grow this economy by building infrastructure, be it the roads or be it the dams, creating water and jobs for regional Queensland. In fact, for all of Queensland, because Queenslanders deserve to have a government that aspires to a 5% unemployment target. I will not stand by any longer and see the Queensland that I know and love be at the bottom of the economic ladder. I want an economic powerhouse, one that my children, that my daughters can be proud of, and one that they want to bring up their next generation. Let's get Queensland working again.
Look, thank you everyone for coming along tonight, and I'm quite sure you've got other questions. I'm happy to stay around and answer them if you want me to. But can I just say this very clearly? There is a clear choice that Queenslanders have to make, and it's a very important choice about the future of our state and where our state goes. What we've heard today from the New South Wales Premier is that with Ms Frecklington, the borders would have been open months ago. Now is not the time for risk. Now is the time for stability, not chaos. Now is the time to chart the course forward, to make sure that we're all working together. I have honestly done my best for this state. I work with everybody. I work across the length and breadth of this state. And we have an economic recovery plan which is focused on jobs and focused on you, and making sure that families can raise their families here and make sure they've got jobs for their kids in the future. There is nothing more important than the dignity of work.
Thank you very
so
much.
I ask everyone to think very closely, and the single question you should leave here tonight is, how is Deb Frecklington going to pay for her promises? She is refusing to say, and that is not fair, and you are voting now.
Premier, thank you. LNP Leader, thank you. All the best to both of you on the weekend.
Thank you so much for having us.
And
Thanks,
we
Kieran. You've
thank
done a great
everyone
job.
in the audience as well. We're going to have a vote on the way out. Use your wristband to say who's convinced you. One person's been discounted because they've got a party preference, but the rest, please go and vote, and we'll see you soon on Sky News. Thanks for your company.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.